Hello and welcome to episode number 298 of the Armin Show podcast. I'm your host, Armin Shervanian, and it's always cool on here. In this episode, our guest is the author of Life's Edge, the life that we all lead. Life's Edge, the search for what it means to be alive. Author Carl Zimmer joins on the show. He is a professor at Yale in molecular biophysics and biochemistry. He's a science writer, blogger, columnist, journalist, specializes in evolution, parasites, and heredity, contributes to the New York Times, Discover, and National Geographic, and is real prolific. Carl, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I am glad to. In the previous time, we only had audio, but on this time, we are in full video, which is exciting. Long live the future. The first thing that always comes to mind is a focus that I always take note of. You are very prolific. You have written a lot of books, many, including She Has Her Mother's Laugh. We spoke about that before. How did you become so prolific in the first place? Was it an effort, or did you always just make things?
I have, whenever, as far back as I can think, I was always writing things, little short stories or cartoons or something. It's certainly, when people tell me like, oh, I'd love to write a book, but writing's so hard, it's interesting because like they clearly do not like to sit down and write. And I have to say that like, I like that, now I don't like it when I write something I'm not satisfied with, and I don't like it when I have to revise a draft or that I thought was in great shape before. There's a lot that's hard about writing, but it's just something that I've always done. And working at magazines, I started at Discover magazine, and now mainly contributing to the New York Times. That's certainly good training for getting things done. You have a deadline. There's a space on a page that's waiting for your story. People don't want to hear about how you're not quite satisfied with a piece or you're just waiting for inspiration to strike. You've got to get it done. So that kind of gets you into the habit of focusing on a subject and really sort of bringing your effort to bear on it, and then finishing. And so then you can go on to the next thing. I've been doing this for a while now. So you do get more efficient as well. I mean, I remember the first story I wrote must have been like 300 words. About some beetles in the Caribbean who give off a interesting glow. And oh my gosh, I must have worked like 2 weeks on that story. It was just torture. After a while, you can do a story like that in a day, maybe in a couple hours after a while, just because you know sort of how the pieces fit together, you know how to interview people, you know how to get the questions you need answered. But that just takes practice. So, when I talk with people who are just starting out with writing, I just say, look, don't be too brutal on yourself. Just be ready to just sit down every day and write.
This is a great point about the early process always taking way longer, but not necessarily needing to take way longer. Would you tell the person who was writing that original article of 300 words to just put something out?
No, because, if you're just doing your first piece, you don't, there's just so much that you got to learn, and so much, and you don't yet have that sort of intuition that everything that you need is there. I will say that I felt it was a great stroke of good fortune, I guess, that I was doing this on a staff at a magazine. I'm talking the early 90s. So this is, way back when, and this is like, very different than the journalism landscape today. So a lot of people who are starting out are freelancing and don't have a whole lot of guidance from editors. It's definitely there are a lot of challenges that comes with that. And I think that I think that publications would be better off offering more mentorship to the people that they're getting work from, rather than just chewing people up and spitting them out. So it's there's journalism has changed a lot, and in some cases not for the better, I have to say.
I like this point about being a two-way street, being more beneficial. When I recently talked with ethicist Susan Liaotao, she talked about how companies that have terms of service have a requirement or ethical interest in also explaining it well to the consumer so that they could fully understand what's being said. It's like a two-way communication. In the same way, it makes sense that if publications can support the people who are with them and give them guidance, kind of like a program. Do you know David Perel, the writer, or programs like that? No. There are some people on the internet that are like writing teachers, and they'll run like 1,000-person course and kind of thing. Do you think that is valuable, or that is like a short-term fun hobby more likely, and usually the person that would have written on their own would have written on their own?
I don't know. I mean, it can be valuable. It really depends a lot on the person. There's some people who are very self-motivated and are really just effectively taught themselves. There are some people who needed the guidance of a good editor, and then other people who really benefited from going to journalism school, for example, like a whole set of courses. So it's hard to sort of come with a one size fits all type of rule about these things. I do think that I teach a lot myself, and I don't think that these things scale very well. I just don't. I mean, in order to really help, a 20-year-old who's just starting to learn how to do this stuff, it takes time. Now, like outside of the class, I'll have office hours, and I can talk for quite a while with a student, going paragraph by paragraph through a piece, and just helping them to think about how they can find their own voice and tell a good story effectively on the page. So these sort of mass online courses, I'm a little skeptical that they're going to work for writing.
And then one other item on writing: usually before you go into a project, what % of knowledge or curiosity do you already have in that project before you do a lot of research and figure it out? Is it you start from scratch, from nothing, you're like, I'd like to check this out and understand more about this? Or is it you already have 20% of sense on a certain category and then you go fill in the other 80%?
Well, I think at this point in my career, there's a lot of things where I'm following certain lines of research. I want to know like where things stand now. So, I remember when the Human Genome Project was underway in the 90s, way back when, to date myself, like there was a lot I had to learn, a lot beyond what you just learn in a basic biology class, a lot about how scientists sequence DNA, how they assemble these little fragments together, how they read it, how they interpret it. It was just it took years to really get up to speed on all of that. Now, like that, I don't need to do that. But what I do need to do is every now and then I have to stop and say, like, okay, like the science has changed a lot in the past few years. I have to update my sort of basic understanding. Sometimes it's just the technology, the machines that people use are totally different. So DNA sequencing for the Genome Project, like there are technologies like something called nanopore sequencing, which is just fundamentally different than the kind of sequencing that happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So, it takes a little while to sort of get up to speed on how these things work and what their strengths and weaknesses are and so on, and how to write about them. So, I think when you're in a career, you can get more familiar with things, but you definitely do not want to get stuck thinking that everything is the way it was 20 years ago.
I like that point right there. We always have to be ready for the new, or else we're stuck in the past, and then the past will repeat, and that was a waste of the current moment. Valid point. Now, your previous book went into heredity in detail. Life's Edge pulls it back even further. What caused you to make that transition, almost deconstructing another layer back?
Yeah, I would say that, I have just been kind of wondering about this in the back of my head for a very, very long time. And the time just felt right to delve into this as a book. I write about biology. Ever since I wrote that first article about beetles in the Caribbean, I've been writing about living things, and there's a lot that they have in common, but they're also very different. A glowing beetle is very different than a python, very different than a jellyfish, very different than a redwood tree. So what unites them? And you can say, oh, well, they all have DNA. And it's like, okay, well, so what? I mean, what does that mean? People and people will sometimes say, well, here's a list of things that everything that's alive has in common. Those lists tend to fall apart when you look at them closely, or you will end up with really hard cases where you're like, well, is this particular example alive or not? And you don't really know. And so I just found it fascinating that scientists have come up with hundreds of different definitions of life and continue to come up with new ones. They're not converging towards one. And so, in a way, the more we learn about the details of life, one species or another, or particular kinds of cells and how they behave, we still are left with the huge challenge of understanding life and drawing that edge around it, trying to figure out, well, what is different from the living and the non-living worlds. So the book is kind of a travelogue along the sort of borderland.
Now, for this category, which scientists are the go-to scientists in order to figure out where the edge is? What category of scientists are the best for that?
Well, it's interesting because biologists are usually not trained to think about these issues or to work in this borderland. So I write about certain kinds of life in the book that, I think are really exemplary sort of hallmarks. They show hallmarks of life in a very exemplary way. So metabolism is obviously a really important issue with life. And for me, the champion of metabolism is pythons and boa constrictors, because they go from eating nothing for weeks to suddenly swallowing an animal whole and increasing their metabolic rate to incredible levels, like a galloping racehorse type level, in order to break this food down. And then they absorb it into their body, and then they go back down to that different metabolic rate again. So, there's a scientist that I spent time with feeding rats to snakes and talking about what was going on inside of them, named Stephen Secor. And, he's spent 40 years pretty much just focused on studying snakes and increasingly trying to figure out this incredible feat that they have. So that's it. Like, you do not go to him to ask about a redwood tree. So you do have to go and look for some unusual sorts of scientists. So often it's like the scientists who are studying the origin of life, or who are trying to make life from scratch, or trying to find life on other planets, who are kind of backed into thinking about these issues. Scientists who study viruses, where they have this thing staring them in the face that is kind of alive and kind of not alive. But even then, it's amazing. A lot. I will talk. In the book, I talk with an astrobiologist named Laurie Barge, and I'm like, "What's your definition of life? As you think about whether there's life, say, on a frozen moon of Saturn." And she's like, "I try to avoid them." Like, it's just kind of gets in her way, she finds, of her research. So sometimes you're actually like left talking with the philosophers, like, because they're the ones who are really thinking through the meaning of our concepts, what we intend with the words that we use, and how those affect the way we do science.
I like that, looking at the edge between items. I recently spoke about the edge between ethics and law. This is the edge between life and non-life. Looking at extremophiles makes sense. The most extreme organisms that we know of. Aside from metabolism, what else is a feature that looks to be informative as far as life?
One is homeostasis. And this is a really incredible property of living things that I think gets kind of overlooked. So you and I are holding our body temperatures very stable, even as we go inside or outside, as the air around us is hot or cold. And that takes all sorts of very complicated networks of responses to to keep things stable. The same goes for our levels of blood sugar and other things that we need to keep very, very stable in order to operate. We create an internal environment, and other living things do the same thing, and they can shift their homeostasis around. So a hibernating bat, I write about hibernating bats that I visited in the book, and they can be flying around and be working really hard and being able to dump a lot of heat out of their body so they don't overheat. And they can sort of keep that homeostasis. But then, in the winter, in northern areas, bats will go into caves or abandoned mines and then shift into hibernation, where they're still alive, their metabolism is still running, but their temperature is down to, body temperature is down in the 40s, I believe. So you can set these set points for homeostasis, and even bacteria can do this in the sense that, like, they keep levels of different molecules inside of them relatively stable and in balance, and you have to keep these cells have to keep things in balance, or they just get disrupted and die off. So homeostasis is another one. In addition, there are things like reproduction and evolution, and also I argue in the book that there's something that you could call intelligence that's a hallmark of life. And I don't mean taking an SAT test. I mean the way that living things are able to perceive their environment and make decisions based on that information. And so I focus on these weird creatures called slime molds that they live on the forest floor. They're these weird sort of pulsating mats of goo, and they're just, each one is just a single cell, a gigantic cell, but just a single cell nonetheless. There's no brains involved, no nervous system, nothing except a cell. But that cell can move around and optimize the way it travels and finds food and feeds in a really astonishing way, and in a way that actually actually mimics the way that mathematicians solve mathematical problems. So that's another property of life that I think gets overlooked.
I like that part. I've always enjoyed slime molds, and what they do with not much, quote, intelligence, like we would describe it. It's almost like I think of cities and how they'll develop from the main center and go outward to the certain points that would be the most next populated, almost like water. And then we do that. And then a slime mold would also do that. But we would think that water is inanimate and then the slime mold is not intelligent and we're the top of the line. I always find that to be funny. That's pretty good. One is we're looking at different types of organisms, but what about within organism? This is a, I guess, more popular issue, but between when an organism, an egg is fertilized and it is growing, when is that alive? When is that not? This is way more popular than I usually go in terms of topic, but where would that be at?
Well, here is an incredibly controversial way of thinking about life. When we think about reproduction, the fertilization, and development of embryos, it's very common for people to talk about this in terms of life. In other words, like, when does life begin? And so there are a lot of people, especially a lot of politicians, who will say over and over and over again, life begins at conception, and science proves it. And, I think there again, we have to stop and say, well, what are we talking about when we talk about life? I just gave you a bunch of hallmarks of life. And, in many ways, those cells that gave rise to that fertilized egg, they were alive. They had homeostasis. They were managing their internal environment. They were carrying out metabolism. Sperm and eggs both have a certain kind of slime mold type intelligence. Sperm know how to find eggs. They swim along and hunt for them. Eggs, quote unquote, make decisions about which sperm to accept. So I think that, when you really push at this, that whole notion just falls apart. Maybe people mean, well, a life begins at conception. In particular, they mean a human life. But what distinguishes a quote unquote human life from the very moment before? People will say, well, it's because now there's a new genome. And it's like, well, sorry, no, that's not good enough. Because at the moment of fertilization, those two genomes of male and female remain pretty autonomous and separate. They're operating separately. It takes a while before they really become integrated into a genome that is operating as a new unified whole. Even then, if you take that genome as being like, oh, that's it, now we mark the time where a human life has begun, that mass of cells can split into two, and you can now have identical twins. So we've gone from a human life to two human lives, and yet that genome was already there, so that falls apart as well. You can have other cases where these clumps of cells from different embryos fuse together and form a new unified whole. That person, sometimes it would be called a chimera. That person does not get two votes. They're not two people. They're not two human lives. They're one human life. So, I just think that, and again, we are tempted to come up with simple stories about life, and life always defies those simple stories.
Mm-hmm. I've never been a fan of the simple story that lacks nuance, because there's always details missing, and it's a nice popular message, but it doesn't have much thought. Speaking of that, actually, critical thought, how often do you see a good level of critical thought in public discourse, and how can that be spread further?
There are a lot of options we have for uncritical discourse. we have incredibly powerful companies that have made huge amounts of money sort of optimizing social media to give us things that make us respond in a very emotional way, and not actually like engage with people in a particularly meaningful way. But there, of course, there are, people still do read books, and which is heartening. And podcasts, depending on the podcast, it can be a good way to sort of engage with some of these issues. But again, podcasts can also just turn into a couple people sitting around and saying, "You are so right. That is so right. Those people are idiots." And I get tired of those sorts of conversations pretty quickly.
Right. I think that is a lot of podcasts. That's a good point. There's some agreements there. And you know what, Carl? I don't agree with what you're saying. I'll counter those.
And therefore, you're a terrible person.
Darn it! I've been found out. Yeah, we disagree. There's a lot of counterforce here, and people should know that. Joke. That's pretty good. Now, opposite of the A concept is when we can declare someone legally not alive anymore. They have lived, and at some point transitioning, where is that cutoff point? Is it the brain?
Again, it depends on what you mean by life. We define death in part by how we define life, and we are increasingly forced to think about this in ways we didn't have to before, just because we have new kinds of technology that can prolong life, I guess we can call it, in ways that were not possible before. So, for example, I talk in the book about the development of ventilation machines and how that created sort of a new class of patients who had massive brain damage, but were still functioning at the level of their lungs taking in oxygen and their heart beating and all the rest. And so this new state of being needed a name, and so this led to the concept of brain death, and brain death being a legal definition of death. But that people have challenged that, and I write about one case of a girl who lived for a couple years on a ventilator in this without brain function, and her mother did not want her taken off because she felt, well, she's still alive. And some people argue like, well, her body does have homeostasis and all these other features, so why isn't that life? And then others say like, well, for humans, like life means that all these systems are integrated, and the most important level of integration is our brains. And if you don't have a brain anymore that can do that, then you're not alive. So, we, again, people who think that these are simple questions will find themselves sooner or later in these very difficult cases.
Right. The questions lead to that's the cool part about writing up or coming up with questions. It takes you in a category. You had to come up with the question in the first place. One thing that comes to mind is, who are some key scientists you have met along the way who have given you key information or were valuable to you as far as this book or this one and recent books?
Well, one scientist who comes to mind right away is a scientist named David Deamer. He's at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's been retired for a little while now. He's in his early 80s. I have been reporting on him off and on for, gosh, I want to say, well over 20 years. And he studies the origin of life, and he has developed this interesting view about how, an important aspect of life is that living things have boundaries. So you and I are not just these diffuse clouds of molecules. If we were, we just sort of like disperse, and that would be it. So in order to have all the cool reactions that take place in the processes and the information flows, we need to be tightly packed. And so he's been asking for a long time, well, how would you get, protocells with boundaries? And he studies molecules called lipids. These are sort of fatty molecules that help form our cell membranes, and they're, thanks in part to Diemer and other people, they're now ubiquitous in technology. So like maybe like your shampoo has little lipid spheres with little chemicals inside of them, and so on. And even our COVID-19 vaccines take advantage of this. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are these little bubbles of lipids with RNA inside. David Diemer actually thinks that maybe the first forms of life kind of looked like those vaccines. In other words, a little lipid bubble with some RNA inside of it. And he has done research, right about the book, suggesting how maybe in ponds on the sides of volcanoes on the early Earth, life could have come about this way. But it's a challenging thing to say exactly when life began. You might have had like sort of cycles of chemistry taking place that, like have a certain lifelike quality to them, but aren't life as we know it, but then eventually gave rise to cells that could really like do a lot of the things we think of as life. So he's still busy writing away. He's started up a couple companies based on his concepts, and he's a fascinating character. So I really enjoyed writing about him at more length in the book.
Right. You had mentioned protocells. In the book, you had mentioned like the beginnings of just the cerebral cortex of the brain, but not the other parts as much. Based on what you have looked at, what does it look like as far as how soon we create multiple parts of the brain working in concert?
Yeah. So when I was getting interested in when life begins, especially human life, I started to explore some of the advances in reproductive technology and developmental biology. And I think one of the most amazing developments is the ability to make what are called organoids. And so these are clusters of cells, clumps of cells that behave a lot like our organs. And the most incredible of all, I think, are the brain organoids. And so what you can do is you can just take a skin cell from someone, put it in a dish, hit it with some chemicals, and essentially you reprogram it so that it's going to behave like a cell in an embryo. In particular, a cell that's like a progenitor of a brain. So this neuron starts to grow and divide and divide and divide. And now you have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of these neurons all growing together in your dish. And they are differentiating. They are forming different types of neurons, and they are forming structures. So like our cortex, which is sort of the outer layers of our brain, where a lot of our most important thinking takes place. You see layers like that in these brain organoids, even though they're a little clump smaller than a pea. And they even start to produce what seem like brain waves. So, if we're, there's something strange there about like, well, is this a new life that's beginning? What is it that we're dealing with in here? the this is a pretty new science, so I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but one possibility is that scientists are going to be able to grow organoids for different parts of the brain, the cortex, maybe the cerebellum, maybe some sort of, you can grow a retina organoid, and then you can plug them together. People are already starting to do this. And do you then have an organoid that can see? Can't rule that out. Is this going to be an organoid that can learn about what it sees? I don't know. But it's really quite astonishing research.
This is true. I'm always most interested in the brain, and I always found it to be the most interesting part of basically our planet, because it seems to make almost everything else, which is pretty cool. Now, we had mentioned scientists, but what about, are there any science writers that you have modeled after or have looked at as key individuals in that category?
Certainly when I was starting out, there were some writers who I really admired. Some were scientists, like Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist, who showed how you could, or they showed me how a magazine essay could about science could be a real art form. Then there are nonfiction writers, often journalists who are writing about science, who show how you can turn science and the writing about it into a real literary genre. I think maybe the first one who made a real impression on me was maybe Jonathan Weiner or John McPhee. I've certainly gone on to read lots of other great stuff that that's influenced me one way or the other. In my class, I teach a day about Silent Spring, not so much as for its historical importance in giving rise to the sort of environmental movement that we have today, but as a piece of writing, because it's a really astonishing work of nonfiction. There are lots of writers that I admire. I've been trying to sort of keep a running list of some of my favorite pieces that I assign to my course on my website, because there's just so much to pick from.
I like a lot of things mentioned, like keeping a record is nice. Also, I like where you said they showed, and then you switched it to showed me. In life, I notice there's things, and then there's the things that really resonate with us that suddenly we're like, oh, okay, this is something we can look at and take from, and it's only for us. Maybe a lot of other people would notice that same thing and just pass by, and it's not a big deal to them. But some things fit us, which is kind of cool. One thing that I noticed when I am reading a variety of science-related books, do you notice a variety of research coming from certain areas? Like the United Kingdom has a good chunk of evolutionary biology, or certain regions have way more research than other regions?
I do think that there are some ways that some countries or regions specialize in some kinds of science, and during the pandemic, a really important part of fighting the coronavirus was tracking its evolution, and there are a group of evolutionary biologists who specialize in looking at mutations in viruses and using that information to build their family tree and to track how the virus is changing. They've done it for influenza and Ebola, and now they're doing it for COVID-19. And the real center of that world is in the United Kingdom, and so they've really led all the world in our understanding of that. I think that for my own part, I think I probably don't have a very good sort of bird's eye view of things, just because I think language is one issue. I speak English pretty well. I speak French terribly, and I don't speak anything else. So, so if you're not able to really like connect with language, then you're just not going to be that aware of work that's happening elsewhere. So there are amazing studies happening all over the world, and language and other factors can make it difficult for reporters to really access that stuff. So that's one of the nice things about a sort of a journalism world that is, connected online, and where you can potentially have people writing from different parts of the world, because there's the possibility that people with different kinds of experiences, expertise, cultural backgrounds can tell stories that, somebody like me sitting in the northeastern United States would not be able to on their own.
That makes sense. As far as the impacts from the last year, how much has that changed journalism as it applies to you as related to maybe 2-3 years ago? Has it changed that much, or were you already very electronically and virtually established before that?
This past year has been pretty intense. So while I was finishing up Life's Edge, I was helping with the New York Times' coverage of COVID-19. I'm still doing that. And we're suddenly the science stories were the front page news every single day, and sometimes several times a day. And so we've had to work really hard and develop new ways of presenting information, like trackers to show where vaccines are in their development. We have not been waiting so much for papers to come out in peer review, because a lot of times the information is just too important to wait. But that creates risks, because you might be giving attention to a study that's just not very good and will be misleading and soon to be disproven. So it definitely has had new challenges. I'm hoping in the next few months that life is going to kind of move back towards something more normal. And I don't know how much of these changes will stay in place, and how much we'll sort of swing back to the way we did journalism in 2019. We'll see.
Right. The counter perspective is cool. As far as Life's Edge, I always like to check, what is one message you would want all people to know, a takeaway message about the book that they could use for their daily life?
I think that in our daily life, and there's that word again.
I always make this as a challenge.
Yeah, I would say think about that life that is your daily life, and ask yourself, well, what is that exactly? What does that mean to you? And what is your daily life? What does it have in common with maybe the daily life of the pine tree out your window, or the monarch butterfly that's flitting past? What do you have in common? And how are you different than maybe the mountain you just hiked the other day? These are questions always worth asking, and there are, you may not be able to find an answer, but that's okay, because centuries of scientists have tried to find an answer, and they've failed time after time in the most interesting ways. And I try to sort of give a sense of some of that fascinating failure in my book.
Fascinating failure. That's alliteration, everybody. Now, I would like to thank you for having been on this episode. It is wonderful to speak with you. You're very conversational and fluid, and that comes from science writing and prolific nature, and also your internal. Glad to have you on this show, Carl.
Thanks so much for having me. Good talking with you.
And you as well. And we are out.